In today's webinar, our expert Julie Hunter will discuss debt recovery and the importance of maintaining a healthy cash flow. She'll explore how to mitigate and tackle debt recovery issues in more detail and what this means in practice. This will also provide advice in relation to exploring good business practice, due diligence, to name a few. Julie is a senior associate and commercial litigation solicitor at Stephensons. She has over 25 years experience. Julie has a general and varied commercial litigation practice, but her speciality is in financial disputes for commercial clients. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Julie now. Julie can unmute herself. Off you go, Julie.
Morning, everyone. Thanks, Sean. Today I'm going to cover a few simple but fundamental points to bear in mind in your credit control and debt recovery processes. So we will be covering the documentation so that you know and can prove who is liable to pay your fees, and general credit control processes, hints and tips, and then what to do when all else fails. So if we go to my first slide, please. Firstly, I want to cover the importance of documenting who is responsible for paying your fees. Now, if you go to the first slide, please, Sean, the question of documenting fees. So generally, it may seem obvious that you will know who is liable to pay your fees, but it's surprising how many cases I see where it's not clear who the debtor is and who we need to recover the debt from. If you have an agreement with a local authority, that's quite obvious, and generally speaking, that will be well documented and it will be clear who is paying and when payment's going to be made. But in the case of private payers, where you've got top-ups or your resident's a private payer, or where you're being paid by somebody who holds power of attorney or a relative of the resident, you need to make sure that you've properly documented who it is that's liable to pay your fees. Because if you don't, if the matter has to go to legal proceedings, you're going to struggle to prove who's liable and what fees they're liable for. So if we just go to the next slide. In order to protect yourself against any future problems with private payers, you need to make sure that you've properly documented what your agreement with the payer is, who the payer is, what they're liable to pay, what services you're providing, what exactly the fees are for everything, and when payment's due. So you need a properly documented written contract. Most contracts are clear and in writing. They can be oral, but generally speaking, in order to make sure you've got your best prospect of recovery, you need a document that's in writing and preferably signed by the payer. So your contract should be clear, it should be dated, it should be signed, it should set out specifically what services you're providing and how much they're for. If you also make clear when you'll raise invoices and when those invoices fall due for payment, it'll make it much more difficult for the payer to dispute whether or not payment's due and when to make payment at a later stage. So documentation is the key to make sure that you can protect yourself if something goes wrong and they don't pay. This is the same where top-ups apply. So you might have a case where a local authority is paying principal fees, but the resident or the family of the resident has agreed to make payment of top-up services. Here again, you still need to clearly document with the payer who's paying, what the additional fees and extras are for, what they are, what services you'll provide, when you'll raise invoices or how payment's going to be made, and how much that's for. So the simple point to make is put it in writing. It doesn't necessarily have to be a formal legal document. It can be, for example, a letter that you've signed and you ask them to countersign. It can be an email which you ask them to acknowledge. But if you've got something in writing and preferably signed, you'll find that it's much easier to recover your debt at a later stage. So problems arise when you've raised invoices or fees fallen due, but they haven't been paid. So to try to overcome this, I'm just going to run through with you some basic good credit control procedures. If we go to the next slide. So the first thing to say is when you've identified who your debtor is, it's important to keep up-to-date contact information with these people. So people move, people change address, people change mobile phone numbers occasionally and email addresses. So it's a good idea to check regularly to make sure that you've got up-to-date contact information for the people that are paying. It's easy enough if it's your resident, but if it's a relative or somebody that holds power of attorney, you need to make sure that you check every 6 months or so, just to make sure you've got the right address, the email address and so on for the debtor. The second and the most important thing, I think, is to act promptly, because the older a debt is, the more difficult it is to recover. That's just a simple rule. So when your invoice has been raised, send it out. Make sure it clearly states when payment's due, how much the payment's for, and give details of payment methods. So you will give your bank account detail or who checks should be made payable to, if that's going to be the method. But act promptly. If the due date for payment has passed and you've heard nothing and no payment's been made, start to communicate with the debtor. The earlier you do this, the more likely you are to recover payment promptly. So the first thing I would say is that after the invoice is, say, 7 days overdue, I'd call them, ring them up and just remind them that payment's due. Ask them when they're likely to make payment so that you can make a note of when to expect it. If you don't get any response, email them or write to them and ask for a date. A gentle reminder at this point often produces a payment. Just remind them the payment's overdue and let them know ask them when you can expect payment. If you're still getting no response, a formal letter should be sent after 28 days at least have passed. Now, a formal letter can be merely a request for payment, or you might say, can you please arrange payment, because if you don't and you don't contact us, we're going to have to escalate this. And that's sometimes enough to prompt payment. But if you've reached a stage where you're not getting any response at all, or people are putting you off, you need to send a final letter warning people that if they don't make payment, you're going to escalate it. Now, a hint I found long ago often works for people at this point is that if you just head that letter in reading, urgent, please deal with this immediately, you might find people will respond to it. Now, it sounds a simple point, but it does often prompt payment because people then realise that you're serious about taking the next step. And the other thing to suggest is that you should offer various ways that you'd like to receive payment. So you may say at that point, if you're struggling, excuse me, then we'll accept payment in 28 days or over a period of time. So if you're open and honest about being flexible, you might find that people will come to the table and start discussing with you how they're going to make payment. But the overarching message here is to act promptly, because the longer you leave it, the less chance you've got of getting your money back. Okay, so on the next slide, can we go to the next slide? When you've reached the stage where you've exhausted your credit control methods, and even before then, you'll find that typically debtors fall into two categories: those that can't pay and those that won't pay. Can't pay debtors can often be very embarrassed about the fact that for some reason they've fallen into financial difficulties and they can't make payment. Won't pay debtors will do everything they can to avoid payment. So can't pay debtors are the easiest to deal with, and really the trick is to open a dialogue with them. Now, often your staff will know about relatives or whoever holds power of attorney who are liable to pay these fees, and they'll know what sort of car they drive, whether they live in an affluent area, and will be able to give you hints and tips about whether they think they're able to pay or maybe just need a bit more time. So with debtors that can't pay, the trick is to open a dialogue. So you might approach them and say, we haven't heard from you, you haven't made payment. If you're struggling, we are open to talking to you about receiving payments by monthly instalments, or to put back the payment date, or in some way to otherwise be flexible about getting paid. Because if they feel that you're prepared to give them a little bit of leeway, they're far more likely to come to the table. And if you are able to negotiate a payment plan, then the important thing is that you do document that. Again, something in writing and signed would be ideal, but an email confirming you've agreed to pay the debt of whatever it is, X, over a period of 3 months by instalments of X per month, starting on this particular date, that will evidence the agreement to pay, the fact that the debtors have admitted that they're liable for it, and will enable you to enforce that if they don't pay it. So won't pay debtors will either ignore you and then leave you in a situation whereby you have to decide what action you're going to take, or they'll raise a dispute. Now, they may say, it's not me that's liable, it's the local authority, in which case you'd have to evidence the documentation to prove the top-up agreement. Or they may say, you haven't provided the services that you agreed to provide, or you did something wrong. When you get these sort of disputes, the first thing that you should do is think seriously, is there any merit in them? If there isn't, you should be responding and saying, we don't agree with you and this is why. If there is some merit in it, you might want to think about offering a discount to reflect an issue that might have arisen, or extending payment terms to reflect any other issue. But the important thing is to address them, don't just ignore them. If you just tell the debtor that you don't accept what they're saying and move on, you might find that you're criticised for that at a later stage if the matter went to court action. So address the disputes and try to find a way to resolve it with the debtor. If all else fails, you're looking at sending a final demand for payment. If you haven't reached an agreement, if no payment's been made, or if a payment plan's been made and not kept to, you need to issue a final demand, setting out clearly, this is how much you owe me, this is when it fell due for payment, you haven't paid, and so we're going to have to take the matter to the next step. Now, at this point, you need to consider whether you're going to take legal action. If you're going to do that, you're going to find that you have to first send a letter before action. There's a pre-action protocol in court proceedings for these cases, which requires you to serve a formal letter before action, which will say, this is the amount that's due, this is how much is overdue, this is the interest that's accrued on it. If you don't pay, we are going to issue court proceedings. The letter will also have to give them the opportunity to file an answer setting out any reasons why they're not paying, or to make a payment proposal, and it gives them 30 days to respond. So you then have to wait 30 days after you sent your letter before action before you can issue any court proceedings, and that's a timing that you need to bear in mind when you're dealing with your general credit control process. So if after the letter before action period has expired, you're issuing county court proceedings, those proceedings are going to result in a county court judgment. Contrary to popular belief, that's just an order from the court that directs one person to pay another person a certain sum of money, and it's not going to get you your money back. What happens is that the order is served on the debtor, and then you have to take the next step to enforce the judgment. So it's a process that is going to cost you some money and isn't necessarily going to automatically get you your money back. I should say that generally speaking, if you took 100 debtors, once you've sent out that final demand with the red ink, you usually find about 60 will pay or will come to the table to negotiate a settlement. About 30 or so will then pay when they get a solicitor's letter before action. The rest will leave you to issue proceedings, and all but one will file a defence. So it's very, very rare for these cases to be defended, but sometimes you have to take a lot of action and spend a lot of time and administrative time getting your money back. which is why we go back to the beginning and say it's your credit control processes that are the key here, because if you get that right and you work promptly from the outset, you'll find that you're more likely to get your money back quickly. So just summing up on the final slide, I think these are just the main points that I think are really important to consider in helping your cash flow, because obviously if your debts are paid on time, you're going to find that your cash flow is significantly improved. But also getting your debts in promptly once they have fallen overdue. And so these are the 4 key points that I think you should bear in mind. The first is it's very important to document the terms that are agreed, so you clearly know who is paying you, how much they're paying you, and when payment falls due. If you have that, if you do have to take legal action, you're going to find that it's far easier for you to prove that you're right, that the debt is due, and far more difficult for the defendant to dispute liability. Secondly, act promptly. Don't just leave it in the hope that they'll pay, because won't pay debtors will not pay you unless they're absolutely forced to, and can't pay debtors will often bury their head in the sand. So you need to act promptly and offer payment options, because if you're open and flexible, you'll find that it's easier for you to get your money back. You may have to wait for 6 months to get your money back, but at least you'll get it back in the long run. So offer payment options and be flexible, but most of all, keep the pressure on, because as I say, if you leave it, debtors will ignore you and they'll only pay the people that shout the loudest. So I think that's probably covering just about all of my general hints and tips on credit control and debt collection. I don't know whether we've had any questions, Sean, to cover my part.
Thank you very much, Julie. We have got some questions. So you can see from that slide that we were hoping that Jeremy Huban from the HSBC Bank would join us today, but unfortunately he's been unable to. But we have got some questions for you, Julie. Firstly, what happens if the care is funded by the local authority, but relatives have agreed to pay top-ups?
Well, in that case, your fees are split. So your local authority is going to have the liability to pay whatever is agreed in your contract with them, and that's fine. You can recover your money from the local authority, but often you do get top-up situations, so relatives will ask for extras on top of the care, the standard package of care that's provided. And in those cases, you need to make sure that you do have confirmation from the relative that they are going to pay for these top-ups. It's important to specify what they are, what extra services you're providing, and how much is being paid for each of those additional services. And as I said before, get it in writing so it's clear, you know exactly what you're responsible for providing and they know how much they have to pay for it. And make it clear when each payment falls due. So if it's an annual payment, then you need to make sure that that's clearly specified the date for payment. But more likely, if it's a monthly payment, you need to give a specified day on each month when the payment is due for that, and raise your invoice on that day with a clear date saying when this invoice is due to be paid. Okay?
Yeah, thank you. Second question: what happens if the bill payer has moved address and we don't know where they have moved to?
Well, this is one of the reasons why I suggest that you regularly keep up to date with your contact details, because people do move, and if the resident is no longer with you, you're going to find it far more difficult to get payment. So we have an ability to trace people. We use inquiry agents to find out where people have moved to. So you would need to employ that process, find out where they are, and then issue invoices to the new address, reminding them that payment is overdue. So there is a way of doing it, perfectly above board, but to avoid that, keeping up to date with regular contact details is the key.
Thank you. And then the final question, Julie, can I charge interest on overdue debts?
Yes, you can. It's helpful if your contract says that the debts, if they fall overdue, will attract interest, and specify an interest rate. But If it doesn't say that, then you do have the ability to charge interest at 8% per annum, which is statutory interest payable according to the County Courts Act. So you can charge 8% per annum from the date the invoice fell due, which is a fairly significant percentage rate for interest, but that's payable when paid, so it will continue to run up until the date when payment's made. So if you include in your letter of demand a note saying if they don't pay, then you will charge interest and the cost of recovering your debt, that does tend to prompt people to make payment because they'll know otherwise they're going to be paying a lot more.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Julie. That was very interesting. Well, I'll just end by telling you about some other upcoming webinars that we have planned. We're hoping to deliver these webinars every Thursday morning throughout the summer at 11 AM. Next week, the 25th of June, we have Martha McKinley, who's an employment solicitor at Stephensons, Brendan Ryan, who's the Director of Health and Social Care at Hayes Recruitment, and Jim Thomas for Skills for Care, talking about dealing with management, performance and the well-being of staff during the COVID crisis, something that any business owner or manager is having to grapple with at the moment. The following week, on the 2nd of July, Sophie Maloney will be talking about the withdrawal of clinically assisted nutrition and hydration in a patient's best interests and the role of the Court of Protection in these cases. And Stephen Woodhouse on the 9th of July about how to deal effectively with whistleblowing concerns. And then we've got other webinars, as I say, throughout the summer into August and September, and hopefully you will join us for those. Keep your eyes out on our social media accounts and please help us to promote these webinars far and wide. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and that is the end of today's webinar.